Well, thank you guys all for coming and for turning me on. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. This event is hosted by the Cybersecurity Initiative. We are convening a conversation on the supply chain, really the security of the software supply chain. So most of the time when we talk about supply chain, we're talking about hardware, we're talking about industrial systems, physical items. In this case, we're talking about code. Code being moved between computers, built, distributed, maintained through its life, and then brought gently to a close at the end of its life, as opposed to just falling flat on the floor. With me today for this conversation, I have an excellent panel, and I want to introduce very quickly each of them before we get into the conversation. To my left, Bobby Stemfley, Director of the CERT Division at Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, and a non-resident senior fellow here with the Cybersecurity Initiative. To her left, Michael Daly, CTO of Cybersecurity and Special Missions at Raytheon. Just past him, Sherry Caddy, who's Director of Public-Private Partnerships at the National Security Agency. And on the end, Brandon Graves, Counsel at Davis, Wright, and Tremaine. So we're going to talk today about the security of the software supply chain, get into some ideas of what sorts of factors influence to greater or lesser security within vendors, within customers buying this sort of equipment. What sorts of issues does the government have to consider when it's thinking about acquiring or regulating or building code in this way? And what kind of factors should we be thinking about as informed consumers who are actually voting and listening and reading about these issues as we go through and understand what the supply chain looks like today as opposed to 5 or 10 years ago? So with that, I want to give it to Bobby to open up. We're going to go down the line for some thoughts. I have a few questions. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative, and then we'll open it up to the room. Lead us off.
Great. So this is a great topic because the idea of expanding our understanding of supply chain beyond what we've historically thought about it is really important, particularly in a world where not only is software fueling everything in an IT context and an OT context, but everything is becoming programming. And so, you're actually writing software when you do synthetic biology, right? It's in a different context. And so all of these, it opens the aperture for the topics that we're talking about today to something pretty broad. We've been given a lot of thought at the CERT division about how the transformation in how software is developed has occurred over the last 20 years and what that means for increase in quality of the output and what that means in terms of meaningful places for interventions to ensure that the supply chain, the production life cycle of software is more and more secure. I'm going to take issue with your one comment about and put to bed because I can't tell you a piece of software that is no law, right? I mean, the way software has evolved, even the Defense Department is coming to grips with the fact that there's no such thing as a development and sustainment life cycle, that you have this sort of constantly evolving animal that is the software that we use in the things that we do with a variety of levels of rigor in the production based on the sort of mission activity. And then software, so we think about software in that broad life cycle, and then you think about the services that you acquire which are in fact software driven as well. And so this idea of what kind of interventions you need to put in place in the production of your software so that it is the risks of the supply chain are reduced, and then what kind of interventions you need to put in place in your procurement of services that are fueled by software provided by others as well as the dimension of open source here, right? We're back to this pro versus con of open source versus proprietary. This sort of supply chain conversation has brought this back really to the forefront, and not saying one is better than the other. They have the same issues, just have different development models and different business models around them. So I think it's a really fertile landscape for us to think about. One of the most important interventions to think about is your purchase as an intervention, right? So what are the controls you need to put around your purchase? So we think about this along that sort of entire life cycle of activities there. So just some opening thoughts.
Certainly going to agree with all of that and say that it's even, it is a great time to have this conversation, and you see everyone putting out new studies and reports and guidelines around secure supply chain because we're seeing this change in the way we develop. Mm-hmm. And as you noted, the fact that software is in absolutely everything we do, but also because the complexity of systems has grown. and the complexity of our business operations has also grown. Whereas before you might do all of your accounting in-house and somebody had a ledger in front of them, well, now you're using software as a service out on the internet to even do your accounting. Or your healthcare systems. At Raytheon we used to have our own physicians in-house in the buildings, and of course we certainly don't do that anymore. So we have shifted to a very complex supply chain, and all of those supply chains are driven by software. And on top of it, even our government customers, who historically have always wanted that one-off solution, hey, I need a system to control a radar. Well, you would think that, that has to be a one-off solution, but that's no longer the case. I want the bulk of this thing to be commercially based software that is trusted and tested out in the world. I want to see open source software embedded in there so that I'm not dependent on a single contractor. So we've seen our customer make that shift as well, and that means that we have to adapt and change how we integrate commercial software and software practices. And lastly, I'll say around software practices, the other shift that we're seeing is from that waterfall delivery method, which, as you know, we had a different set of testing and compliance that went along with that life cycle of development. And now it's agile development, it's DevSecOps. And so the cycle time for making changes is now on a 12-hour window, or faster for other companies, but I guess we're a little more cautious.
Okay. So yeah, agreeing with Bobby, supply chain, not a new thing. We've been talking about equipment, we've been talking about software for years, but really the evolution of the services model, the as a service model, software-defined everything means that this is newly a front burner issue, and of course the globally hyper-fragmented supply chain associated with both services and software development really just has introduced a whole different set of risks, a whole different dimension on an old problem that just didn't exist before, and requiring that attention. And this is not just a government problem, this is not just an industry problem, but it's really something that we have to work on together in partnership. Our problems, the government is concerned about visibility down the supply chain of who's touching not just the software or the components or the pieces, the subroutines that are amalgamated into large systems or suites of capabilities, but also who's touching my data as all of these software-driven functions are ever more reliant on large pools of data to train your AIs and other things. Accessing and touching that data, and how do we ensure the integrity of that? So these are a whole new set of really critical issues that we're working on together across government partners that have equities in this, as well as with not just the IT sector and the defense sector, but really every single critical infrastructure sector has a play in this space. So that puts a lot of hands on deck, but it also makes it a really large and complex problem. So focused efforts on what we can do together to meet these challenges is what we're working on at the moment.
Excellent. We'll talk more in depth about specific rules and best practices, but how can we impose those rules and make sure that they're enforced on the software developers through the supply chain? This issue is especially problematic with software because the barrier to entry to enter the market is so low. The visibility back into the supply chain can be poor. You don't necessarily know who your vendor is getting their subcomponents from. A lot of the rules and regulations that we've established in other supply chain areas are more difficult with software because the transmission, the country of origin challenges with software all make drawing analogies from our past practices difficult. I think it's useful to look at the different ways that we can impose rules on developers, both the government imposing rules and then also industry imposing rules itself, which is a model that's worked in software development fairly well. So you have formal regulation. The challenges with formal regulation promulgated by a regulatory agency is what should those regulations say, which is something that we've been challenged with information security writ large, separate from software development for a while, because the threats are changing drastically, rapidly. They're hard to predict. And regulation, formal regulation at least, is slow, especially if it's a notice and comment type period. So maybe formal regulation is good for some high-level guidelines. It's going to be very difficult to impose any kind of specific rules through that process. There's also enforcement agencies. The FTC around reasonable security has been especially active, where they look at effectively the worst actors in an area, and they negotiate a consent decree with those actors about what they should have been doing. They post that, and then they tell everyone else in an industry segment, look, this is what we think reasonable security looks like for this fact pattern. Draw some lessons from this, see how it applies to your agency or to your company. That's good, and that it's more flexible. The FTC can be dynamic and react to changing circumstances, but it's really difficult for the regulated entities to draw lessons from those consent decrees. Once your fact pattern starts changing, once what's applicable to you is different, then what lessons do you draw? So there's still some flexibility in the joints there that is both good and bad. Another area that the government has been successful is through its purchasing power. We see a lot of this, a lot of my private clients comply with NIST, not necessarily because it's formally imposed on them through law, through statute or regulation, but because they want to enter into contracts with the government. They want to be able to show that they comply with these NIST special publications to their private business partners.
I think it's because NIST puts out a quality product too.
And NIST, it puts out an excellent product, although you know, some of my European clients like to point to ISO, so it really depends. You know, everybody's got their preferences. And that's been effective because NIST works with the industry. It has amazing expertise in-house. It can draw on expertise from outside, and it can push out documents that are comprehensive. And it also gives the contracting officers flexibility when they're looking through the specific control families that are applicable to a given company or a given contract. And so, you know, with a regulation or more formal rulemaking process, we kind of get into a one-size-fits-all problem. But if you have well-trained, diligent contracting officers, you can work with them to figure out which controls are applicable and only impose those controls without the additional cost of unneeded controls. Mm-hmm. And one other area I'd like to point to is industry self-regulating. An example of that is the payment card industry, right? Once they started to digitize the transmission of cardholder data, there was a number of breaches. Congress got concerned, and the payment card industry said, we've got this. We're going to establish our own security standards. There are definitely problems with the payment card industry standards, but it is a list of rules that are applied through certified assessors, and the compensating control aspect within the payment card industry rules is really interesting because it allows you to get into a discussion with your assessor. Hey, you don't meet this specific control, so we can't pass you. Okay, but I have these additional compensating controls that address the risk your control was attempting to address, and we think that they provide adequate security for the cardholder data, and you have that back and forth. So you're not paying a lot of money to, say, update a past end-of-life system that's critical. You're putting additional controls around it. And I think that flexibility is absolutely essential for any kind of workable regime on securing the software supply chain.
So this is interesting, and I want to dig into something that Bobby raised that I think everyone else has referenced to. Software doesn't die, or software never dies. Sort of the Bond movie version of this discussion. I wonder how flexible or how secure and resilient the software development process is from the waterfall method to agile. And I ask this for this reason. If software never dies, and if every update I'm pushing is now percolating its way through this chain with increasing rapidity, I'm iterating potentially every 12 hours for some features, has the way that we have trained engineers and has the way that we've regulated this process to the extent that we have, has it been done with this sort of incredibly rapid, high volume of change in mind? I.e., do we even have systems in place that are willing to accept changes popping every 12 hours, especially with those that might have really strong security implications? Is the pipe strong enough for this new model?
So I would start by saying this isn't this is a new model, but it's also a model people are using today. So it's not as though this is we're just dipping our toe into modern development practices. This has been a 10-year transition, and we have business processes and entire businesses that our financial well-being is based on their ability to push out new updates in a regular basis, whether it be every couple of hours to every 12 hours to every couple of days. So there's some faith and trust in the fact that the pipe is strong enough in certain dimensions. There are a whole bunch of things that are important in order to have a strong pipe, though, that I think it's certainly, and be interested in hearing what your thoughts are on this as well, Mike. And that is, there's a ton more automation in how you develop software today than there ever was. Decades ago, I walked out of college and into the only job offered to me, because this was a time when engineers couldn't find jobs, and it was, I hope you know C because we have a problem and we need you to literally sit at a computer and write code every day, right? My daughter came out of college, that's not how she writes code. There's a ton of automation in it, which actually lets us intervene in a variety of steps of the process that we couldn't have at the time when I was getting compiler errors, not pre-compiler errors, not syntax errors from other steps. So it's not as doom and gloom, perhaps, as you present. What do you?
So a slightly different perspective, because I heard sort of an academic question embedded in there, and having had the academic portfolio at one point in some previous jobs, I think it's really interesting that if you go to campuses and you talk to the faculty in the computer science department, or you talk to faculty in the engineering department, there's an astonishing gap in teaching kids at least at the university level security by design principles. And while on the one hand we've seen the rise of degree offerings in cybersecurity, which is fantastic, that just a degree field that just didn't exist 10 years ago. It's where universities put cybersecurity is kind of interesting and varies widely. Part of the business department, part of the computer department, part of lots of different sources. But making that linkage between all of the security elements and some of the existing long-time programs around engineering and computer science isn't as well as it could be. And I know, having talked to a lot of faculty about this, we have accreditation and everything's full, and if we just put one more thing in, something else would have to drop out. But I do think that that's a continuing conversation that we need to have with that pipeline of how do we take some of those longstanding traditional disciplines and make sure that we're teaching. I mean, we're never going to get a body of trained workforce that can do ICS SCADA security if we don't start teaching engineers cybersecurity, at that sort of fundamental level, at the undergraduate level, and even before that. So how do we begin to blend cybersecurity into some of those existing disciplines? I think is an ongoing, fruitful line of effort.
Yeah, I think it varies widely across the academic landscape.
Yeah, to your point, actually, we have seen a great improvement in the security quality of our code when we switched to agile development and DevSecOps and started doing it the right way.
Right.
The doing it the right way part is that we created some orchestration tools and actually partnered up with some other companies in that space as well. And so what we do is run a battery of tests on every single write and commit.
Right.
So that, as you were talking about, you're actually getting feedback as a developer all along. You didn't declare that variable correctly. You need to go fix that. Or you just linked to a library, but that library is out of date and it has these vulnerabilities, so you need to link in a different library. Or even better, hey, a new CVE just came in about that library that we thought was okay yesterday, but because it triggered the tool, a scan was run, and now we know that your code is vulnerable, instead of waiting for it to get into production and find out that you had a vulnerable piece of code.
You want to define CVE for us? Just for the audience.
Yeah, vulnerability. Yeah, it's just a standard naming mechanism for a type of vulnerability in a particular system, and you just give it a number, and a CVE is a number. Yeah.
And quickly down the line, how would you guys distinguish this ability to push rapid change relative to hardware design? right? 'Cause presumably secure by design or secure design principles can be used in both hardware and software. But what makes this so much different versus how you're building and deploying hardware?
Golly.
Yeah.
The reason I say golly is that so much of hardware is now also software.
That's right.
It's software not only in firmware, which is the more obvious, but even the design itself is written in a format that's actually software. You know, so
It's all
that
programming at some
it's
level.
all programming that you can then analyze for all the gazintas and gazadas and checks and so on. So yeah, really, it's becoming very much one and the same. You know, even 3D printing, right? You know, you can look for flaws in the design through the software structures.
I think we're just coming to grips with how speed and volume, and when I say volume, the flexibility you have in hardware design when you want to produce 1, 2, or 3 of something versus the cost of it's cost effective to produce 1, 2, or 3 of something versus producing 100,000, 200,000, and 300,000 of something really changes, I think, the way you think about a whole range of these kinds of practices. But what it does is means that you have to think about your supply chain and the security elements of your supply chain all the way back into this tool chain that you have in your software development. So when I talked about the
software factory.
interventions, where can you put these interventions? I think to your point of what kind of guidance and regulation can you give people in how they build their software? You have, through this automation and through the data produced by the automation, you actually have more visibility into how these things might be happening.
And I think one distinction, this rapidity that we're seeing is, at least in some development houses, we'll fix it later, which is problematic, that you don't necessarily see it on hardware. And to your point that software can now modify hardware in a lot of instances, if you have a place and they're like, we'll push it out, we'll have the security architect sign off on it later, we just need to get this out. Maybe it's a feature set or it's something small, and we'll release a patch later. You still have a gap of vulnerability that you don't see in other manufacturing supply chains that you do in software.
I think that the lesson for us as a community, as we come to grips with speed, so later may no longer be 6 months, it may be tomorrow. That's not a bad, right? That's actually a good thing if you can squeeze down that later element. But the lesson for us, I think, as a community is measuring the uptake of the fix. And we have a lot of experience in sort of vulnerability space of uptake of the fix not being what we want it to be. And so we're going to have to really think about this more broadly.
So this is interesting, and it spirals off a question I wanted to ask to Brandon, but then for the rest of the group to respond to. What is reasonable security, right? If I'm asking a vendor to adhere to a consent agreement to some other party in their industry, what am I defining as reasonable security? And in particular, to the point that Bobby just raised, what's different when it's a vendor versus a customer? I.e., if I am the consumer of software and I'm deploying some reasonable standard of security for my customers, versus I am the one building the software to some reasonable secure standard. So what is a reasonable standard? I'm curious what people think.
So reasonableness, they like to drop it in laws because it is so flexible, and there's not one answer. But when my clients are looking at what's reasonable, I like to see some sort of formal risk analysis conducted. You know, what are my assets? What are the threats and vulnerabilities to those assets? And then what control measures do I need to put around those assets to mitigate the risk to an acceptable level? Because every security control has a trade-off either in cost or usability, right? The most secure computer is one that you've shredded, but you've lost all your usability. So we need to be flexible in only imposing the controls that offer a benefit that outweighs the reduction in usability or the increase in cost. And that's why reasonable is used in so many places, because that is an individualized decision. Now the question comes, you know, a lot of enforcement in this area has been people who have no security or they've never done a risk assessment. So the question comes, once we start getting to a place where everybody is making these decisions, how do we critique those decisions with 20/20 hindsight in a way that's not overly punitive? I think that's a challenge that people haven't really grappled with yet. Part of it is going to be workforce training. Do we have people who can adequately assess those risks? Part of it's going to be best practices guidance. Some of it's going to be hard standards, absolutely non-negotiable security controls that customers want to put in
I think you
place.
see some of that now with, you know,
GDPR.
yeah, well, but and
California.
also, you know, DoD's cyber
Oh.
maturity model of this reach to try to impose standards in a space that has been very hard to nail down from that aspect.
Yeah, the root, I think, in a lot of these expectations is around how that system, how that software handles your data. So one is GDPR, but another's around ITAR or controlled unclassified information or any of these categories. It all comes down to the confidentiality, integrity, availability of a specific data set. That's not everything, because when it comes to industrial systems, then there's a different expectation, mean time to failure, and all of that. Yeah.
I think in the industrial system, integrity becomes greater
More
valued than some of the others.
Reliability.
And I'm sort of in that space. So yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I don't know how to define reasonable because it varies across the board. I'm going to take a moment, though. There's some work that one of the researchers at CERT has done, a group of researchers at CERT have done, led by Carol Woody, where they've developed an application security framework for supply chain that that really says there are key places, back to this interventions. We can define security and reasonableness within the context of the use case we have. Great. What are the interventions and where do you put them so that you have a confidence level that it's been accomplished? And they really have refined it around key areas. What are the relationships you need and how do you govern and manage those? Oftentimes those are in contract or in some kind of formal tool, but what are they, and do all parties understand them? So if I'm the producer, if I'm of the piece of software, what am I bound to in those relationships with someone else? If I'm the purchaser, how am I binding somebody else? What are the engineering mechanisms that are used in the production of the software itself? So what is the factory? How do I employ the security within that factory? What are the concerns when the piece of software goes into operation? Now that's a vague term in that context, and I know, but how do you operate it securely? How do you put in place things like a software bill of materials that then gets consumed into an operating mechanisms that's there? And then because we see such integration of the supply chains, what's the intervention in the integration of that supply chain? So I'm producing a piece of software, I'm giving it to somebody else that it rolls out of my software factory into theirs, or we're sharing, and what are the interventions in there? It becomes a way to think as you define reasonableness as an outcome. Now these are the places you can manage that reasonableness. And then as an organization, you think about what your external dependencies are. So where am I buying a service? Where am I purchasing a piece of software? What are those external dependencies that I'm doing that risk assessment against?
How do we take that? I think thinking about reasonableness and the standard that might be baked into a certification process that might be baked into. How do we avoid designing regulatory mechanisms to drive good security behavior, which are designed to do one thing and then instead lock in a state of behavior or lock in a contemporary understanding of what security looks like or how security is achieved? The waterfall to agile transition is really interesting because they are not just different development practices, but they're different cultures in how you do development and where security sits in that process. So as we're thinking through this kind of current generation, CMMC, the cyber maturity model is a good example. How do we avoid creating fragile instruments that actually create security harm down the road? Answer the unanswerable question, I guess is really what I'm saying. What are some tenets or what are some things that we should be thinking about as we go through that process?
I kind of want to fall back again to that confidentiality, integrity, availability paradigm, only because in the end, those are the things that you care about, and reliability as well. So you kind of have to add another piece to it. But I think you have to measure based on ultimately that utility as the final effect. Is my information protected from other people looking at it? Can somebody else modify it? Is it going to be there when I need it? I think that you have to fall back on that in the end.
I think part of the challenge of this space is not only do you have to anticipate dynamic change in the future, which I think is what you were getting at, but we're still living in the space where we haven't, lifted the lowest common denominator, and we're still talking about cyber hygiene, and we have adversaries that still use the most basic, dumb attacks for the software supply chain and are highly successful. So we're trying to actually work both ends of the spectrum of the future change and ability to adapt. But how do we really just lift that lowest common denominator to be less low?
So one thing we try and do when we're negotiating these things in contracts is look at how much risk is that entity willing to take on? Are they willing to stand behind their product? Because I can ask for certifications. Let me see your SOC 2 Type 2. Let me see your PCI DSS. Let me see all those things. Okay. But if they say, hey, my liability's got to be capped here, that's a strong signal to me that there's something I'm not seeing in either the due diligence in a merger and acquisition, or if it's a vendor, something I'm not aware of. And if they're not willing to negotiate that up, that is, maybe we don't want to do business with them. And so I think as we struggle with what specific rules we need in place, we need to look at these kind of larger heuristic signals to understand, for uptime, right? I have a 5.9 uptime, and what are you willing to do if you go below the 5.9 uptime for availability, right? I don't necessarily need to get into, do you have segregation of duties within your code promotion environment? Are you doing dynamic and static code scanning? I'd like to do those things if it's available, but that's just impractical all the way down the supply chain. But if my direct relationship is willing to stand behind their product with something that is real, right? If you have a small startup and they say, oh, no limitation of liability, and they're going to go out of business, that's a problem. But if I have a real guarantee that they're willing to stand behind it, I can offload a little bit of this analysis.
So there's a lot of discussion around hard to measure concepts like trustworthiness, and it's
the 5G discussion,
Yep.
like taking a practical application.
trustworthiness, which I will say NIST did define in 839. But really hard to measure, come up with a set of metrics that it captures practices, durability, personnel. That certainly is a factor in risk, and as well as those relationships. And I think that it seems most companies tend to fall back on the relationship with that vendor, that entity. Have we had a good relationship with them in the past? And that's one indicator, but that certainly isn't dispositive.
This focus on end state is interesting. I take the CIA point. Really, what I need is to define what I want the outcome to be. I want to define some secure sentence.
And would you know if it failed?
Right.
And
I mean,
can you
that's
measure
the,
that? Right.
part of that 5G anxiety of, well, if data started leaving, so I didn't have confidentiality, how would I even know, right? Yeah.
But there's two challenges there, it seems. One is and I think to Sherry's point, you have a wide distribution of capability in this ecosystem. So you have small vendors or new vendors that maybe don't have the ability to execute at the same level as an established
Or
vendor.
have a very different risk tolerance.
Also a good point, right? Are willing to accept and design in risk in a different way. But the other is that you may have organizations that are willing to play some games with what that outcome really is. So how do you balance the fact that what you really want to do is define some end state, get everybody there, but at the same time you have to combat the either willing or not inability of some entities to get to that point, right? Whether they're playing games with how it's defined or they just don't know how to actually execute on that. Where's the point of balance, right? How do you still create some sort of forcing function?
So I'm not sure this is a thing that has really been rattling around in my mind since last week or so. Was a report that was published on supply chain that separated corporate responsibility from government responsibility. It sort of decomposed this problem a little bit and said that there are things that governments can and should do and agree not to do. That would change the dimension, and there are things then that corporations can and should do to be good citizens. There's this
especially when they're multinationals and they have multiple laws to comply with, right?
Right, exactly. And to me, that unraveled a little bit of the Gordian knot that that I felt like we were stuck in for a while, to say, the government's role in a whole range of places can be applied, but they're also setting the tone for a set of behaviors that exist. And so there might be things outside of the technology domain that would be important to use. I'm not sure it's exactly where you were headed, but
It's interesting though, the differentiation is important
yeah.
here, right? That there's a shared responsibility to get to a good end state.
Right. And the definition of an end state is the responsibility of all parties, not just the producer of the product or the consumer of the product.
I want to come back to something Sherry said, talking about risk and risk tolerance. One of the really intriguing parts of this debate is that different organizations think about risk in different ways, shaped by what they do in the market, where they are in the market, their legacy in the market, as well as the kind of work that they're doing. We've seen in the last couple of years, particularly in the last 18 months, a lot of conversation about how business risk and decisions being made by companies should integrate or should consider national security risk. And that's obviously not a new phenomenon, but it's taken on some new prominence in thinking about supply chain security. For the group, but Sherry, I'm curious for you in particular, how have you seen this done best? What's the mechanism or what's the process that really brings these two communities together without one jumping up and down on the other and sort of determining their risk tolerance by what that organization believes to be the one right, true way?
So I would say, just in the context of public-private partnership, this really is the crux of the live space that we're working on now. The government makes decisions, particularly the intelligence and defense enterprise, makes decisions based on national security risk. That's our bread and butter, and when certain indicators are met, that's the decisions made. But we recognize that the business community makes decisions on business risk. But those two, I think in the past the dialogue has really tried to, I think some of our private sector partners have tried to insist that business risk is completely separate from national security risk, and it's not. And I know that everyone has a bottom line that they're working towards, but
Too big to fail.
Too big to fail. But there are certainly instances where companies are making decisions that aren't 100% bottom line driven, that they are taking into account some of those risks. And we have to explore that space of really, I think from our perspective, how do we find ways to drive more of that national security risk into the business risk decision making? That we can't have a goal of everyone thinking about risk in the same way that we do. But we have to understand that space better, and particularly when we're talking about things like sharing information on threats and vulnerabilities. I think the challenge on the government side is that everyone wants some kind of magic, what they like to call the smoking gun of information. Give me the specific and actionable information that's going to help me make a decision. The problem is we all make risk decisions on different bases, and so what is red flags and alarm bells in the national security community in terms of risk. Might just yield a shrug from certain private sector partners. So understanding, and this is part of what we've been exploring in the context of public-private partnership. What are those risk decision thresholds? And as I alluded to a minute ago, one of the findings that we've had in exercising how risk changes when some of the parameters of the transaction change. One of the findings is really the disparate nature of risk between size of organization. So a big outfit like Raytheon can afford to not just go with the cheapest option and buy something that's slightly more expensive but is a lot more secure. The startup that's the proverbial startup that's two folks in the basement, creating the next killer app. For them, they're willing to take a whole lot of risk to grow fast, get market cap, all that good stuff. And I like to say, risk and security is just a speed bump on the way to time to market, very much so. So the risk tolerance is really just quite a bit different for the size and position of those organizations, and yet they're all part of that hyper-fragmented supply chain. So how do we account for those very different risk pictures? But the point of exploration is the mutual understanding for industry on the government side. Why, what are the elements of national security risk that make us make a decision of, no way? And then what are those things? What are the things that change?
Like whatever.
or some of the named entities that have come out recently in the NDAA. And then on the industry side, what are those specific elements that are going to drive business risk? So as industry looks to the government to tell us about these companies that are risky, that might have concerning relationships or aspects of how they do business. There's not a simple blacklist or whitelist, but I don't think that we're in a position to provide that actionable information to industry because we don't understand how what are the factors in the risk decision. What really drives? There is no smoking gun, but what is that? Even if there was, what does it look like? Is it if a company that is owned by some foreign intelligence person, if it's behaved badly in the international sphere, if there's all kinds of things that one could know about a company or about a product or about the people associated with that company or building that product. What are those factors? What does the threshold look like? Because it's all of those things, and I think some companies have a more mature understanding of what their aggregate risk picture looks like and taking into account all those factors, but a lot of them don't, and it's just kind of, I know it when I see it, but that's not a basis for defining requirements for threat information sharing. So I think that's the space we're working in right now.
It's interesting. I want to throw it open to questions. Yeah, I think we have, please. We have a mic right here back on the side. I have to give a second. And if you could just identify who you are and your organization.
I'm JC Hertz from a company called Ion Channel. We do software supply chain assurance in the intelligence and defense community. I also co-chair a Department of Commerce software transparency working group about software bills of material. And one thing that jumps out at me was earlier this year at the Chamber of Commerce when FICO announced their cyber risk score of massive passive scanning of everyone. The detail that really set my ears up was they're finding that larger companies actually had worse scores than smaller companies. They were less secure. And the reason they were less secure is called mergers and acquisitions. Because you buy a company and all of its closets and servers, and those things are still on. And your enterprise CISO will never know. But they're all exposed. So sometimes, and this gets back to the agile conversation, a clean sheet of paper gives you a lot of security. And that legacy where we work is just, the tolerance for risk is actually huge. It's just oblivious. Because people don't even know what's in their stuff and where it comes from. And that somehow it's like a sunk cost. So I would challenge this assumption that big is, because it's more well capitalized and resourced, inherently more secure because it has a lot of junk lying around in the back of the fridge that's not secure, and we really need to worry about this. And any comments from folks who deal with big legacy organizations would be welcome.
That thinking is what's driving a movement called Zero Trust, which I have to say we have adopted before other people were calling it Zero Trust, starting actually around 2004, our company, so a little advertisement if you don't mind. But and the Zero Trust concept is that this enclave here is for the financial people, and they need to see these things, and that's all they can see. And in fact, if I see that type of worker trying to access this other system, that's a trigger for me. And so we do the same thing with an acquisition. It goes behind a wall that's actually monitoring the traffic and saying, hey, we just saw some traffic trying to come through, and that makes no sense. Let's go check on that. But this concept of zero trust is now moving out across the IT security industry. And it has to do with the fact that we're all becoming interconnected, and our supply chains are so complicated, and not just supply chains in terms of technology either, but our people. So walking around the office, well, there's a subcontractor here, and they're a subcontractor to a contractor who's also in the building, and so we've got this complex array of people.
So the first number first several years of my practice doing breach response almost exclusively caused by acquisitions, to your point. Because, and what I tell my clients is it's not a linear increase in vulnerabilities, it's exponential when you plug those two networks together. I think companies are getting better at including cybersecurity in the due diligence process when they're looking to do mergers and acquisitions. When the ICO releases its reasoning behind the Marriott fine, I think that is going to turn a lot of heads and really incentivize that. And so it's getting better. But I think you're absolutely right. Big companies that have been there a while, either legacy systems, I had a risk assessments that still talk about COBOL, or through acquisition, can have problems. I think the point, though, that we were trying to make is doing secure software development lifecycle is hard and expensive, and you are more likely to see it at a more mature company. But like anything else, there's a lot of caveats to that.
Well, it speaks to this segmentation of development is not the same as integration, is not the same as continuing maintenance, is not the same as deployment. So you may have the resources to develop it right, but if you're not writing any new clean sheet software and you're just trying to kludge together 6 different formerly different vendors' pieces of code, that's an interesting problem. Right up here in the front.
Thank you for the wonderful comment. I want to bring this up to...
Name and organization.
Sorry. My name is Dong-Yeon Kim from Voice of America Korean Service. I want to bring this up with the alliance structure. So, like you mentioned about 5G, Huawei, and for example, South Korea, which United States Force Korea stations at, is already invested some large part of Huawei 5G for softwares, or I would say the hardwares, and you said that trust is all the matter here. What would happen? What does it imply for cooperating with the alliance on information sharing? And also in the private sector, South Korea is one of the largest exporter in U.S. market. Does that? But those manufacturers comply to South Korean government regulation, and so their evaluation risk is different with the United States. So when those allied countries' company is exporting to United States market, does that have a negative implication in the future?
And
There's a lot packed in there.
Yeah, it's interesting to note, I think, too, that there hadn't yet, and I applaud the group, because I think this is an interesting point of discussion. In an hour talking about supply chain security, not a single country had come up, right, until the question, which, grant, is an important one, but not a single country had come up, which I think speaks to the perspective of professionals in the field and thinking about how they assign trust to entities, that it is organizational, that it is product-based, that it is many things that are not nationality, or at least not nationality to start. The second piece, though, I think your question is asking a lot more about hardware, given that that's the discussion around 5G. So I guess maybe to reframe for the group, how do we think about the standards we set for ourselves relative to the standards we set for other countries or vendors in other countries, particularly when those countries are significant allies of the United States, and as we're thinking about risk, not just in where we operate at home, but where we operate abroad?
So I will say in the public-private partnership context that recognizing that our large companies are part of a very global supply chain, and that is absolutely part of the discussion, that we certainly aren't trying to force standards that are not going to allow our companies to sell globally. And I think there are no magic answers to that, but it's certainly front and center with the discussion that obviously, I think that some of the recent questions illustrate that everything's connected. There's no way to say that this is a special safe place over here that's not connected to risk from any other entity. So I think really what we ultimately have to do are look at how do we drive solutions globally, whether it's zero trust for everybody around the globe, or other kinds of approaches, that none of these things happen in isolation, I think is the critical point.
And part of, when we do talk about countries, it's typically because we have the issue of trying to separate the motivations of the country and the control of the country from the organizations that reside there. So the sort of hallmark countries where everyone gets anxious, it has to do with those nation states having more control over their organizations, and so we can't separate motivation.
A lot of that, the laws and regulations in the country can cause issues when it does come up. Data localization is a big one, right? if you're going to do business with a country with strong data localization, and so your data has to reside in that country, what does that do for you and your risk profile? But some of that you need to negotiate costs. But if it's a vendor who is based in that country, that's their cost ostensibly. How do you address that in the contract to make that explicit? Where is my data going? I need to know where my data is going. I need to know where it's saved. And also what remedies are available to you if that contract is breached, especially if there's not a United States subsidiary you can go after. So all of those are considerations that are at least in the private sector, have to be addressed in the contracting process.
Sure, down here in the front.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Nichols. I'm an independent security researcher. Some individuals in our space have discussed regulation requiring a public software public bill of materials. So if Raytheon were to implement JBoss, it would be required that they displayed that they told the public that there was JBoss in there and what version number it was. How comfortable is the panel with this concept of a public bill of material? And are there better ways for us, the taxpayers, to hold to account people who are selling us things?
So I think this idea of a software bill of materials is important for us to really recognize, right? I think to the comment that JC was making, this idea of getting more transparency about what's actually operating in the environment is an important part of how we can do that. The question then of how that transparency, to whom that transparency is provided and how is, I think, a policy question that needs to be answered. And in what format, right? There are lots of, as we're walking down this road, we're trying to answer these questions as we go along. In what format, how can it be produced? All of those pieces, I think, are the sort of next steps of the discussion. But this idea of being more transparent about about the componentry that makes up the software, particularly in the world that we're in today, where we're doing more assembly of components as our development process than actually writing new lines of code, I think is going to become even more important going forward.
So I think there's quite a bit of activity in this space, both with the software bill of materials initiatives, and the NTIA is running that out of Commerce for the government. But also a couple of other areas I would point to. Section 1655 of the latest NDAA talks about source code review, and it creates, our friends in Congress gave DoD a requirement to develop a means to do that, of what's notified, how is it notified, how are you testing source code, what kind of tools are being used. And so DoD is actively working on a process to do that, but recognizing, and we're encouraging them, again, putting this in the context of a public-private partnership. This isn't just a problem that DoD can solve in isolation, but how do we bring in our private sector partners to talk about doing this in a way that isn't going to completely destroy the acquisition process at DoD, but also recognizing that this is a global issue, and companies like Microsoft have been doing source code review and have centers to do that around the world, of doing it for quite some time, and have a lot of lessons learned. So how do you make that transparent in a way that is globally accessible, that we can we drive a global standard for that? Because everybody has an interest in that, not just us, not just DoD. So I think there's an opportunity there to make it better for everybody. And then, of course, NSA is looking at how do we, look at specific components, cryptographically sign elements. We have a trusted computing-based supply chain validation program that's being run out of our research directorate with NIST, and some of the results are that publicly. So can we come up with some technical cryptography-based solutions that help us establish the provenance of the specific components of supply? So there's lots of different efforts that are all working towards that transparency, I think.
It's like food labeling,
Yep.
in calling out allergens and
Although I think it's something
sodium levels.
I always hesitate with the food labeling, mostly because I think some of the SBOM folks have a quick and twitchy reaction to it, in that you're describing provenance and dependencies, not necessarily the recipe that gives you the thing, right? And I think it's a kind of a key distinction for this. And it's an interesting question, and actually I want to drill in on the source code transparency piece, Sherry, that you brought up, because it's an interesting piece of this question. So Section 1655, and I think now last year's National Defense Authorization Act says if you are disclosing source code to a certain list of governments, You need to disclose that disclosure to DoD if that disclosure affects products that DoD is buying. Lots of disclosure taking place in different directions. And the question of what constitutes disclosure and what is source code and how are these relationships being built, I think have been something that were a really intriguing but unanswered set of questions coming out of that. So I guess to pull back just quickly for the group, as we're thinking about the supply chain of software and this question around transparency and accountability for where disclosure is taking place, how do you see disclosure of code as a source of risk? How do you see the interaction of companies potentially with foreign governments or other vendors and disclosing either potentially a library or a whole product?
We turn over to, let's say, to Russia, China, somebody else that we're having struggles with, Iran, right? And we give them the source code for the software that we all know is on our computers, then we've made it that much easier for them to identify vulnerabilities in the systems that we use. So it's definitely a concern. On the other side of that equation, we also value having the source code so that we can validate that the code running on our system is indeed the code that they said. If I hash the code you said, is here and its features and functions, is that actually the code that's installed on my computer? So it's two sides. But disclosing it to other parties, it goes to that trust issue and the motivations of those entities. What are you going to do with that information? There might be ways for our providers to, the vendors, software vendors, to do that disclosure in a way that doesn't hand over the code for them to do vulnerability research on, but allows them instead in some other environment to walk through and make sure that it doesn't have deliberate features and functions that they don't want, or that it matches, that the binary matches what you said the features and functions are.
And this is an interesting question because maybe it gets to this national security versus business risk issue. If I'm not necessarily one of the countries you listed, but I had concern that
And
maybe
they'll change over time.
right, sure.
TikTok,
But maybe I had concern that a U.S.-based vendor was potentially compromising their code or giving access to code in a way that I wasn't happy with a foreign intelligence agency, be that the U.S. or others. Is this the mechanism I need to gain that trust in the vendor? So it's kind of an interesting two-way conversation as we think about that. I know we have a few minutes left, but other questions here from the group back in the corner.
Hi. So I'm Rick Steinheiser, government retired, Central Intelligence. So I have a question about how do you know when there's a problem or that people are going to disclose the problems in their code? Okay, so for example, Baltimore and Atlanta finally said, "Oh my gosh, we've been hacked." And so now, the taxpayers find out that their local tax money is going to pay a hacker, and nobody knows. Okay? So the question is, this is not, it's easy in the U.S., it's a city. Can you hear me? But if it's a country, they may not want to say, we got hacked, and so in order to keep our system safe or whatever, and that's where you get into people being bought off, okay? So that's one question. Then I have a little bit of experience with that in the private sector and government. So some companies, and I'm not going to name names, but some companies when I was at the agency, would come to us and say, "What are you doing in data mining? What are you doing in AI?" So we tell them about, and I'm a research geek. I'm in a funded university research for years, okay? We say, "Well, this is what we're doing." And they say, "Oh, great, that'll help us." Well, okay, well, it turns out, and so we sign non-disclosure agreements. Why? It's bad for their stock value. So as Rumsfeld said, you don't know what you don't know. It's very closely held, just like, on the high side, So, I had to take a polygraph every few years. But if they're trusting, a computer science professor, a consultant, to come in and help them solve their problem at a big company, somebody's got to keep that very, very close because it'll affect their stock value, their reputation, their prestige, and everything. So sorry for the lecturette, but I just want to,
Sure.
toss a few.
Yeah.
So thinking about disclosure in particular of events. Yeah.
So I think that body of problems you describe is why we've had various flirtations with legislative proposals on data breach notification. I don't think anything's bubbling to the fore at the moment, but we've had a number of things introduced over the past 5 years or so, trying to identify a threshold of how do we create some sort of compliance regime to require notifications, whether government or industry, but there's not been, again, a consensus legislatively around what that should be.
And there's a parallel thing that you're referring to, which is about vulnerability disclosure. And there are some protocols that the industry follows around that, where we will typically work with the affected parties collectively to determine the risk and sit around a table. And we talked about previously the break glass protocol as well, that says, hey, if we decide that the risk is now too high in keeping this a secret and we need to get the word out, then quote break glass and get it out. But oftentimes you have to withhold that the knowledge of that vulnerability until you have the ability to do something about it at scale. So it's a risk balancing measure.
And there's actually an international standard around coordinated vulnerability disclosure that our team has worked so that you better understand what are the repeatable questions that need to be asked as you're making these decisions within a particular corporation. And then as the value proposition of independent security researchers, which is wonderful, is as things are identified, we can then help companies stand up their own internal processes if they don't have them in how to handle and respond as they go along. So it's an imperfect system, but
There's actually 50-something state data breach notification
Yeah.
laws, so
Yeah.
there's plenty of them out
See, I
there.
figured you'd have a count.
There are 50 different best practices.
Well, more than that, because the territories and cities have all jumped in. So there's a lot of requirements. I mean, I think one of the things that we're watching with trepidation is when the CCPA goes into effect January 1st and imposes statutory damages for notification. Our company's going to be more and more reluctant. I mean, ideally, you set up a circumstance where when somebody has either a vulnerability or breach, the cost of disclosure to them is low, so they're encouraged to do it, and the cost for failing to disclose is high, so they're motivated. You want them to come forward with a carrot and a stick. And with the CCPA, and $750 per record, depending on what's alleged, the cost of notifying, even if you didn't do anything wrong, can be expensive. And there's a carve out for reasonable security, but as we've talked about here, that's very, very difficult to define. And that's cold comfort once a plaintiff's counsel's filed a class action lawsuit against you. So I think those are the considerations as we create the incentive structures to encourage these discussions about vulnerability reports or notifications about breaches. And there are mechanisms to do it. The government talked about the distinction between government and business. I think there's also a distinction between government as a regulatory agent and government as a customer. And those are things that the government can be doing as a customer in its contracts now, even if we don't have a lot of movement at the legislative level for specific statutes.
No, it's a really good distinction. So time for one more. I want to take from the field, resonating on this government as customer, government as regulator piece. Any thoughts? Any last remaining tidbits? Otherwise, I have one to flag up, please.
On the government as customer, just talk about DAG rules like they have in Oracle contracts, where you're not allowed to scan the product, and if you discover a vulnerability in it, you're not allowed to tell your customer. So those are terms of
Related is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that you might
right.
want
So
to.
if I'm a large integrator, and I've spoken to them, and I find a vulnerability in an Oracle product, I'm not allowed to tell the Navy. There's a lot of kabuki of I don't have anything to tell you, but my screen is on, type of stuff. What do you have to say about that, given that this does affect national security and the thou shalt not scan clauses of software licensing agreements would seem to be at odds with this drive towards security
I mean, at bottom, all contracts are negotiable, right? And if the software license can be a problem, and you need to take that into account because that license is part of the contract ultimately, right? And if you are a large enough purchaser that you can get into negotiations around those terms, that's something you need to be aware of. If you can't, you need to treat it as zero trust, right? If you cannot impose or require the kind of security controls that you think are appropriate for the risk that that software creates for your organization, then you need to, and you have to buy it, right? Then you need to establish your own internal compensating controls to address those risks.
And maybe to that point, it speaks to the variation in maturity around security of companies in the industry. That there might be some that have relatively more progressive attitudes about how to deal with this information, and others that are maybe a little bit more mired in older practices and less helpful policies. I have you guys here, so I can't resist the temptation of asking one more question. We have, and in one form or another, I think you guys mentioned, been talking about supply chain security for decades, much longer than there's been software. And yet, in the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years, there has been a particular peak of interest in this topic, both public and I think within USG and in the policy community. What's driving this pronounced interest now? What is it about that we're hearing about now? Why has this topic come to the fore in such a serious way? And let's go, Brandon, kind of down to the end.
I think there's a lot of different answers to that. Some of it is the change in how development works, and we've touched on that a number of different times. I mean, you're no longer going by the shrink wrap compiler at Babbage's, right? Some of it is increasing sophistication of consumers, both government as a consumer, large companies. Some of it is increased visibility into the effects that software can have as more and more of our life revolves around software. And so there's a number of different factors that go into it, and all of those factors are going to increase going forward. So I think we're going to have even more heightened focus in the future.
So I would point to two things. One is, which I think I said earlier, is just the rise of software, everything as a service, software defined everything, the rise of virtualized services, everything in the cloud. All of that is really part of the old supply chain problem, but a lot of very different nuances, variations on the theme of those old supply chain problems in a way that's very different, and we have to think differently about. So I think the environment has changed in a way that makes this a much more front burner issue. But we've also had some enormous incidents, and thinking in the DoD perspective, the one word that comes up is Sea Dragon. So if you Google Sea Dragon, you'll see a whole lot of articles from a couple years ago on just giant exfil. We've also had some of the major data breaches. What's now old hat. The Home Depot data breach was the HVAC contractor was the vector in. So we're seeing this as a technique of working the vulnerabilities of the tertiary and below vendor as a means to get into those large enterprises that are well secured and locked down. So that's a rising technique, and so those kinds of things are really driving the focus on the extended supply chain in a way that wasn't the case maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah, two things, right? The complexity of the global supply chain is far more than it ever was, and the complexity of the systems. But then it's really a fundamental human thing. We're looking for the right person to blame. So when we have all the breaches, the target one, whose fault is it? Well, it's the HVAC guy. Well, no, it's the software vendor's fault. And everybody says it's Microsoft's fault. Well, so everyone's trying to find who to blame, and that's why we do supply chain, security, is so we can go, it's Bob's fault.
So notice what we did. You took a software supply chain question, and you answered it. Everybody here answered it as a supply chain question, which I'm going to answer the software supply chain component of this too, because
She just said we failed.
No, I didn't. I said it's an incredibly complicated problem, and they're interrelated, and I think that's been a part of the reason why it's been going on so long. And what I see as the major transformation in the last I don't know, 5 or 6 years that's caused us to focus on the software supply chain is that we've decomposed everything. Right?
Software-defined networking.
We've,
et cetera, et cetera.
so there is software, everything, but we've decomposed it. So now you you no longer have a telephone that did a whole bunch of things in a computer and you didn't know what it was. Now you've got a bunch of different apps that used to be integrated, and we're all frustrated because they don't integrate the way you wanted them to before, right? All of that. So now we really are seeing, as an individual, the direct impact of componentry in everything we do and in all of our business processes. So software was this ethereal thing out there. Now it's having a really practical implication on our lives as individuals. While we've simultaneously said we need more computer scientists, and in the state of Virginia now, computer science is a part of the curriculum. I mean, it's part of the core curriculum in public school systems from elementary school all the way up. And so now people are they're like, oh, okay, software, got it. Oh, okay, software, got it. And they're like, now what are all these things of supply chains that I need to really understand this element of it. So I think it's two things. It's everything we just talked about, and that we're now, as a broader community, more understanding of all of the places that software exists in our life.
So I appreciate this. We always look for concise takeaways from the writing that we do and the events that we have, and I got out of this that software is everywhere and it's very hard. So thank you guys for that. Quickly before we leave, I want to thank Raytheon for their support for today's events, in particular the snacks in the back. Second, thank you to the CSI team and the Atlanta Council team for making this possible. And last, I'd like if you could join me in thanking our panelists for today's discussion. I think we all learned something.